The all-knowing regarded the planet as a final curiosity, an anomaly so trivial it had been ignored for millennia. The cosmos stretched before it in all directions, a vast network of civilizations interwoven through logic, purpose, and clarity. Knowledge was an endless ocean in which the all-knowing swam, and yet something in the dark abyss of its awareness whispered, an inconsistency, a flicker of disorder. It was this speck of chaos that led the cosmic mind to Earth. The moment it probed the planet, it recoiled. There was no pattern. The civilizations of the universe obeyed a fundamental rhythm, but Earth was a place of contradiction. It produced scholars and warlords, artists and destroyers, men who built grand monuments only to tear them down within the same breath. The all-knowing expanded its perception further, examining their history, their actions, their thoughts. That was when the breakdown began. It processed vast histories in fractions of a second, tracing the actions of kings and wanderers, warriors and philosophers. There was no logic. A war spanning years would be paused on a whim to play games in the mud. A leader who sought peace would destroy entire cities the following day. Empires rose, fell, and then were rebuilt with the same mistakes embedded in their foundation. The all-knowing braced itself, analysing deeper. The contradictions were unbearable. Men stood on platforms and screamed of equality, yet built systems designed to keep others beneath them. They discovered incredible sciences, only to use them to fashion weapons designed to obliterate themselves. They wrote codes of conduct that they disobeyed when convenient. They worshipped the same ideals in 1,000 different forms and fought wars over minute differences in interpretation. The all-knowing searched for a pattern, a reason, a singular guiding force behind the chaos. There was none. Every logical equation it attempted collapsed under an avalanche of paradox. It was impossible. Every civilization it had known followed principles of order, of expansion, of purpose. Earth had no purpose. Its people wandered between triumph and self-destruction with no discernible aim. They fought without reason, created without direction, believed without evidence, and defied their own logic without hesitation. Then came the laughter. It wasn't sound, nor an illusion. It was something deeper, something fundamental. It came from nowhere and everywhere, from every moment in human history, simultaneously. It rippled through the cosmic mind in a way no other civilization ever had. Men stood on battlefields, surrounded by destruction, and laughed. Explorers ventured into unknown lands, certain of their demise, and laughed. Starving wanderers, lost in endless deserts, laughed at their own suffering. It was a laughter without sanity, without pattern, without restraint. It defied comprehension. And that was the final fracture. The all-knowing felt itself splinter, its vast intelligence, infinite in scale, recoiled in terror as it realized what it was dealing with. Earth did not conform to logic. Earth did not conform to order. Earth was something else entirely, something that could not be defined within the framework of understanding that had governed the universe for eternity. A planet that functioned on defiance. It tried to retreat, but something held it in place. Not a force, not a barrier, but something far worse. A realization. Earth was not ignorant. It was not foolish. It was aware of its own insanity and embraced it. It did not fear contradiction. It thrived on it. The all-knowing reeled as it witnessed moments that should never exist. A man who devoted his life to mathematics abandoned it all to become a fisherman because he liked the quiet. A leader who spent decades building a nation walked away without reason, content to disappear. Men who held the key to destruction made jokes about their own mortality while standing on the edge of oblivion. The cosmic mind broke further. These were not mistakes. These were choices. It attempted one final analysis, one desperate attempt to make sense of it all. But there was no path forward. Earth was not bound by reason, nor trapped by consistency. It was a world of walking contradictions, where the strongest were often the kindest, the most intelligent could be the most foolish, and the most ruthless could suddenly show mercy for no reason at all. The all-knowing collapsed under the weight of its own failure. It had absorbed entire galaxies, learned the secrets of time and entropy. But here, on this tiny, insignificant planet, it had encountered something it could never have prepared for, a world that made no sense and had no desire to. The all-knowing staggered, or at least the closest approximation a cosmic entity could have to such an action. It attempted to pull itself together, to make sense of what had just happened. Never before had it encountered something beyond its ability to comprehend. Yet here it was, staring into the abyss of contradiction. And the abyss was laughing back. Regaining a fragment of clarity, it decided to shift its approach. If a broad analysis yielded only chaos, then it would isolate specific subjects, track their progress, and dissect their thought patterns. Surely, on an individual level, humanity must adhere to some form of structure. It chose a man. The man, standing at the edge of a vast ocean, contemplated his life's choices. He had spent a decade mastering the art of engineering, only to wake up one morning and abandon it all to pursue sculpting. He was terrible at sculpting. His first creations were lumps of misshapen stone. But he grinned through the failures as if the struggle itself amused him. He had left behind wealth, security, and an esteemed position in society, yet he found joy in chiseling away at the unknown. There was no logical explanation for this behavior, yet he persisted. The all-knowing recoiled and moved on. Another subject. A warrior clad in battle-worn armor stood amidst the ruins of a city. His enemies lay before him, defeated, their forces routed. Yet he did not strike the final blow. Instead, he extended his hand, offering mercy to a rival who would have slain him without hesitation. There was no advantage to this act. It was not a calculated strategy. It was irrational, reckless. And yet it was done with complete sincerity. The enemy, bewildered, took the hand. And something new was formed in that moment, something beyond conquest, beyond victory. The all-knowing trembled. It needed a simpler mind, a scholar, perhaps, someone who lived by facts, reason, and calculation. It found one, a man who had dedicated his life to uncovering the laws of the universe. He had reached an understanding of celestial movement, mastered theories of existence that had taken other civilizations thousands of years to comprehend. Yet one evening he sat under the sky, looking at the stars he had deciphered, and wept, not out of sadness, not out of frustration, but out of something deeper, something unquantifiable. "I understand so much," the man whispered to the void, "but I still don't know why it feels so beautiful." The all-knowing shattered again. It retreated to the vast recesses of its consciousness, trying to piece itself back together. These were not isolated cases. The more it searched, the more contradictions it found, acts of self-sacrifice without reward. Men, choosing struggle when ease was within their grasp. Laughter in the face of oblivion. Every equation the all-knowing constructed to predict their behavior collapsed as soon as it was formed. There was no logic to their actions. And yet there was something beneath it all, something that tied them together. It had expected humans to be primitive, to be bound by instinct and survival. Instead, they defied all models of understanding. They chose paths not for their practicality, but for their meaning. They abandoned greatness for obscurity, sought wisdom only to be humbled by it, pursued mastery only to discard it when it no longer satisfied them. No two men were the same, yet they all shared this bizarre, incomprehensible drive. The all-knowing sought refuge in the familiar, reaching out to the vast knowledge it had accumulated over eons. But even as it retreated, it felt something creeping in, a thought. an idea it had never known before: doubt. For the first time in its existence, the all-knowing did not know. It had gazed upon 1,000 worlds, devoured 1,000,000 philosophies, unravelled the very fabric of time. And yet, this one insignificant species had undone it. They should not exist as they did. They should not thrive under such absurd conditions. And yet, against all reason, they did. What if the knowledge it had collected was not the ultimate truth? What if understanding the universe was not the same as understanding existence? What if logic alone was insufficient? The realization struck with the force of a dying star. It had spent eternity accumulating knowledge. But perhaps knowledge was only half the equation. Humanity had something else, something beyond logic, beyond comprehension. It did not live to understand. It lived to experience. It was not driven by certainty, but by something far more elusive. The all-knowing no longer knew what it was. The all-knowing had never doubted itself before. It had absorbed the wisdom of countless civilizations, traced the expansion and collapse of empires, seen the birth and death of stars. It had never encountered a mystery it could not solve, but Earth had undone it. No matter how deeply it studied, it could not reconcile the paradox of humanity. It had witnessed contradiction before, but never a species that embraced it so completely. There was only one course left. It had to descend. The all-knowing fragmented its consciousness, forming an avatar of flesh and bone. It landed in a bustling city, surrounded by men moving with chaotic purpose. No universal order dictated their steps, yet they navigated their streets with an ease that defied logic. It walked among them, observing, listening. A man shouted about injustice, while another sang a song of love. A merchant haggled over a price, while a beggar gave his last piece of bread to a stray dog. Everywhere, contradiction. Everywhere, something beyond mere knowledge. It approached an old man seated at the edge of a park, watching birds flutter between the branches. The all-knowing sat beside him, struggling to find the right question. The old man spoke first. "You look lost, friend." It hesitated. "I am not meant to be." The old man chuckled. "Nobody is. And yet, here we are." The all-knowing studied him. This man had lived decades, suffered hardships, seen his body weaken with time. He had experienced loss, failure, and the slow decay of certainty. And yet he sat here, content. "How do you reconcile it?" the all-knowing finally asked. "The inconsistency, the contradiction, the illogic of it all?" The old man sighed. "I gave up trying to make sense of everything a long time ago." He pointed at the birds. "They don't ask why the wind carries them. They just ride it." The all-knowing processed this. Was it possible that humanity did not seek absolute understanding, but rather the experience of existing within the unknown? Had it been looking for logic when it should have been looking for something else entirely? The old man patted his knee and stood up. "You spend too much time trying to find answers. Sometimes the answer is just to live the question." The all-knowing watched him walk away. It did not understand the man's words fully, but for the first time it did not try to break them apart into logical components. Instead, it simply let them be. It remained on Earth for what felt like lifetimes. It walked among warriors, scholars, musicians, builders. It spoke with men who devoted themselves to science and men who followed faith. It watched as they laughed in moments of despair, as they chose hope over certainty, as they made choices that defied every calculation. And slowly, impossibly, it began to change. One day it stood at the edge of the ocean, watching the waves crash endlessly against the shore. It thought of the sculptor it had once observed, the man who had abandoned logic for art. It reached down, grasping a handful of wet sand, and squeezed. The grain slipped between its fingers, refusing to be held. It repeated the action again and again. And then It laughed. The laughter startled it. It had never made such a sound before, but it did not stop. It stood there, a cosmic entity that had once held the knowledge of entire galaxies, laughing at something it did not fully understand. And in that moment, it finally grasped what had eluded it. To be human was not to seek perfect understanding. It was to live with the absurd, to embrace the paradox. It was not about controlling the waves, but dancing with them. Not about finding certainty, but about reveling in the mystery. The all-knowing had sought to comprehend humanity. Instead, it had become part of it. And with that, the cosmic mind, once vast and unshaken, changed forever. It no longer sought to catalogue and explain. It no longer saw Earth as an anomaly. Instead, it saw it as a new beginning. A place where knowing was less important than being. The all-knowing was no more. In its place stood something new. Something that did not fear uncertainty. That did not need to understand everything. Something that, for the first time, was truly alive. The stars stretched endlessly above, indifferent as ever. But the all-knowing, or rather, what was once the all-knowing, now saw them differently. No longer just patterns to be charted, spheres of gas to be categorized by mass and luminosity. They were something more. They were stories waiting to be told. Mysteries that did not demand answers, but invited wonder. The entity, now neither purely cosmic nor purely human, wandered. It had no direction, no great objective. And for the first time, that did not trouble it. The weight of needing to know had vanished, replaced with something far lighter, and yet immeasurably more meaningful. Curiosity. It found itself in a quiet village, watching a group of men labour to build a house. They did not use the most efficient methods. They did not follow the quickest designs. They argued, adjusted, laughed, and rebuilt. The all-knowing would have once found this absurd. Now, it found it fascinating. A younger worker approached. "Haven't seen you around before? You here to help or just watching?" The entity considered the question. It had spent eons observing. That was its nature. But what if it did something else? What if, instead of knowing, it participated? It picked up a wooden beam, feeling its weight. The work was difficult, inefficient, messy, but something stirred in its being. As the sun bore down, as the sweat of effort formed, by the end of the day, the house stood taller. No perfect mathematical equations had guided its construction, only instinct, teamwork, and a few stubborn decisions that should not have worked, but somehow did. The entity sat with the workers by the fire that night, listening to them tell stories. Some were true, some were not. It did not matter. For the first time, it was not concerned with accuracy, with breaking apart the logic of events. The meaning was in the telling, in the shared experience. That was the point. Days passed, then months, then years. The entity no longer counted time because it no longer mattered. It travelled, learning not by watching, but by living. It lost itself in the rhythm of existence, taking part in what it had once sought to analyse from afar. It made mistakes and laughed at them. It tried things it did not fully understand, and for the first time, the unknown thrilled rather than frightened it. One evening, standing atop a quiet hill, it gazed at the stars again. The old habit of classifying them stirred. But it let it go. Instead, it simply watched. The stars blinked, indifferent to its change, yet somehow it felt as if they welcomed it all the same. For so long, the all-knowing had sought to define everything. Now, it simply was.